Good morning. This is Wednesday, June the 19th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. My name is Ronald T. Hartgrove, and this is my podcast called The Drill. It's about the difference between being a true conservative and being a reactionary. It's about what true conservatism is and why it matters. My podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. It can be heard on iTunes and Spotify, among others. My email address is storytimes@hotmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Ronald Hartgrove and on Facebook at The Drill. I started my socio-political odyssey as a conservative Republican. I knew that I was a conservative Republican because of where I stood on the issues. Although I knew that I was right, I felt as though I was losing all the arguments. And not only me, but all other Republicans seemed to be losing as well. And I knew that if I know that I am right, but I feel that I am losing the argument, then something is wrong. So it was then that I decided to investigate the liberal-conservative dynamic. And after 2 decades of research, I've concluded the following. Being a true conservative is knowing that the essence of any argument is change. Where you stand on change is where you stand politically. If it ain't broke, don't fix it is realistic and conservative. And if it ain't broke, break it is idealistic and socialist. My position on the issues is irrelevant. Political identity is based on philosophical reality. What is it that, let's see here. What is it that is being conserved besides the status quo? Individuality. True conservatives are concerned with the individual, and liberals and socialists are concerned with groups. However, the rights enumerated in the Constitution are individual rights. Not human rights, not white rights, not men's rights, not straight rights. There is no such thing as group rights. The true conservative thinks as an individual for and about individuals. By conceding the concept we, the reactionary, allows himself to be trapped into groupthink, inadvertently promoting the very thing he claims to despise, a bloated, overreaching bureaucracy. As a result, the left appears to win again and again. A word about the left. In reality, they have no authority, no power. They can't win. The only reason that they appear to win is that reactionaries give them their victories. Reactionaries, especially talk show hosts, aid and abet the left. The biggest mistake that so-called conservative talk show hosts make is being reactionary. Being reactionary is an anti-conceptual mentality that involves reacting to arbitrary claims and aping the left. Arbitrary claims are those claims that lack evidence or proof. Aping the left means copying their communication style, which means making predictions and using anti-concepts. Making predictions deprives conservatives of values by substituting forecasting for moralizing. Moralizing involves judgment. Judgment is used to decide ultimately what is real and what is imaginary. We use judgment instead of prediction because we need to answer the question, what should I do? Not what is going to happen. Using anti-concepts aids the left in obliterating legitimate concepts, such as property and conflict of interest. The second biggest mistake pundits make is in confusing traditionalism with conservatism. Traditionalism demands a slavish devotion to the status quo. Traditionalism is a mistake because it is as idealistic as socialism. The socialist tells himself if we can only get rid of the status quo, we'd be all set. The traditionalist tells himself if we could only get rid of change, we'd be all set. If it is true that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, then right-wing pundits do more to honor the left than to defeat it. And that's the introduction to my podcast. And I'm going to read from the Idris Shah, The Tales of the Dervishes. And it's I guess you'd call it an allegory called When the Waters Were Changed. Once upon a time, Kadir, the teacher of Moses, called upon mankind with a warning. At a certain date, he said, all the water in the world which had not been specially hoarded would disappear. It would then be renewed with different water which would drive men mad. Only one man listened to the meaning of this advice. He collected water and went to a secure place where he stored it and waited for the water to change its character. On the appointed date, the stream stopped running. The wells went dry, and the man who had listened, seeing this happening, went to his retreat and drank his preserved water. When he saw from his security the waterfalls again beginning to flow, this man descended among the other sons of men. He found that they were thinking and talking in an entirely different way from before, yet they had no memory of what had happened, nor of having been warned. When he tried to talk to them, he realized that they thought he was mad, and they showed hostility or compassion, not understanding. At first, he drank none of the new water, but went back to his concealment to draw on his supplies every day. Finally, however, he took the decision to drink the new water because he could not bear the loneliness of living, behaving, and thinking in a different way from everyone else. He drank the new water and became like the rest. Then he forgot all about his own special store of water, and his fellows began to look upon him as a madman who had miraculously been restored to sanity. So, let's see. I'm going to read this little clip here. Legend repeatedly links Dun Nun, the Egyptian, who died in 860, reputed author of this tale, with at least one form of Freemasonry. He is, in any case, the earliest figure in the history of the Malmadi Dervish order, which has often been stated by Western students to have striking similarities with the craft of the Masons. Dun Nun, it is said, rediscovered the meaning of the pharaonic hieroglyphics. This version is attributed to Syed Sabir Ali Shah, a saint of the Chishti order who died in 1818. When I come back, I'm going to be reading, I'm talking in general about analysis of editorials and reading an editorial or two from the Washington Times. Thank you very much. Welcome back. So a couple of things that, one of the big mistakes that the right-wing pundits, Rush Limbaugh et al. Make is that they attribute meaning to the left's statements and they, that's not warranted. The left likes to operate on a kind of a magical basis. They don't want to be engaged in debates, because debates involve having to do research and whatnot, and basically debates you're involved in acknowledging reality, which they refuse to do. If you acknowledge reality, socialism doesn't work, period. Okay, so you have to ignore or deny reality in order to make socialism plausible. So they like to use magic, or what appears to be magic, psychologistic tools and techniques to fool people, to trick people, and to bully and intimidate them into going along with the program, whatever that happens to be. An example of this is Nancy Pelosi, a week or two ago, had made a statement about President Trump where she said somebody on his staff or in his family needs to conduct an intervention. It's not a direct quote, I'm paraphrasing from what I remember. Needs to conduct an intervention. And she left it at that. And of course, every right-wing pundit in America was jumping on that, analyzing it as some sort of an insult to the president, and was vigorously defending the president. Wrong on a couple of counts. First of all, I'm not going to defend President Trump because he doesn't need my help. He's already got a staff and a large budget to defend himself. And he's got himself. He gets on Twitter regularly to defend himself, so he doesn't need me. Number two is that Nancy Pelosi didn't say anything that can be construed as an attack. What she simply did was use a loaded word, intervention. Interventions I've always understood to mean, and I suppose it can be used in a lot of different ways, is intervening on behalf of usually an addict, somebody that's addicted to alcohol or drugs, and they're addicted and operating as though nothing is wrong. So you have an intervention. You sit down, they get the family, sit down with the addict, and you say, look, you got a problem here. This is what we see. Okay, this is what we see. This is what we experience from you. You're drunk all the time. You have booze on your breath. You fall down, whatever the case may be. To get this person to realize and look at their problems, to get them out of state of denial. Okay, so that's what I usually understand it to mean. But that's not what she said. She didn't come out and say he needs an intervention because he is addicted or he is, crazy. Some of the pundits that were reacting to this, the reactionaries that were reacting to this, were insisting that somehow she was calling the President of the United States crazy. She did no such thing. She did no such thing. Her statement was completely arbitrary. Okay, so but it was meant to provoke. It was meant to provoke a reaction, because as soon as you react to this, you make it real. Then she can say, hey, I'm not the one that said the president is crazy. Rush Limbaugh did. And it sounds tantamount to a confession. And again, the right then ends up aiding and abetting the left. Don't get caught up in this yourself, because you're going to have your friends, relatives, and coworkers that are on the left that are going to use this technique as well. They may just copy what they heard Nancy Pelosi say, hey, somebody needs to do an intervention with President Trump, or they're going to come up with their own trigger words. Don't allow them to jerk you around. Don't become a reactionary. Listen carefully. And then when they say something like that, get a clarification. Remember, I'm a conservative, which means I'm open-minded. If she has information that I don't have, that he has some type of mental problems or he has some type of an addiction that I need to know about, I want to know. Okay, if all she's trying to do is jerk my chain, I want to know that too. Okay, I can be convinced, but I can't be bullied or intimidated. Now, the opposite end of this is what we heard from Bernie Sanders. I heard it this morning, and I think he said it yesterday, in which he flat out came out and called the President of the United States a racist, a bigot, a homophobe, a misogynist, and I think there was at least one other thing that he, pejorative that he used. And he came out and explicitly said, he cannot come back out and say, I didn't say that. That's what the Republicans or the conservatives are inferring from what I said, but I didn't say it. He did. He flat out said it. It's a quote. The problem here and the game here is, and it should be ignored, all of his allegations, because they're equally arbitrary to Nancy Pelosi's statements. They're just arbitrary from an opposite end of the spectrum, where he makes flat out the accusation, but he fails to define his terms, and he fails to provide any evidence to support his conclusions. And again, I'm open-minded. I'm a conservative. I'm open-minded. If the President of the United States is a bigot, is a homophobe, is misogynistic, is all of the things that Bernie Sanders says he is, I need to know that. We got an election coming up in a couple of years. And I don't want to vote in somebody that's all of those things, or any of them necessarily. Of course, it always, because of our system, we don't get to pick perfect. Perfect's not on the menu. We have to pick very often who's least worst, not always getting to pick the best person. But the point is, I need to know that. So if I have somebody in my life that comes up to me and says, hey, Donald Trump, boy, he's a real racist. Really? What was the last racist thing he did? When did this happen? What happened racist? You saw him at a KKK rally. He's a member of the American Nazi Party. What? How do you know he's a racist? What did he do? Give me some information. Because if he's a racist, I don't want to vote for him. Okay? And you'll stop it right there. Make them do the work. I don't mind if the left wins as long as they win on their own steam, as long as they earn it. What I don't want is cheap victories. I don't want to hand them a victory and hand it to them because I'm not listening. So you got to make sure that you're listening to your political opponents and make sure they're really saying the things you think they're saying. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading from the an entry from the Conservative Dictionary. Thank you very much. Instead of the Conservative Dictionary, actually what I'm going to be reading from is the concept of the day from the Ayn Rand lexicon. And the concept of the day today is God. They claim that they perceive a mode of being superior to your existence on this earth. The mystics of spirit call it another dimension, which consists of denying dimensions. The mystics of muscle call it the future, which consists of denying the present. To exist is to possess identity. What identity are they able to give their superior realm? They keep telling you what it is not, but never tell you what it is. All their identifications consist of negating. God is that which no human mind can know, they say, and proceed to demand that you consider it knowledge. God is non-man, heaven is non-earth, and is non-body. Virtue is non-profit. A is non-A. Perception is non-sensory. Knowledge is non-reason. Their definitions are not acts of defining, but of wiping out. Every argument for God and every attribute ascribed to him rests on a false metaphysical premise. None can survive for a moment on a correct metaphysics. For instance, God is infinite. Nothing can be infinite according to the law of identity. Everything is what it is and nothing else. It is limited in its qualities and its quantity. It is this much and no more. Infinite as applied to quantity does not mean very large. It means larger than any specific quantity. That means no specific quantity, i.e. a quantity without identity. This is prohibited by the law of identity. Is God the creator of the universe? There can be no creation of something out of nothing. There is no nothing. Is God omnipotent? Can he do anything? Entities can act only in accordance with their natures. Nothing can make them violate their natures. God is traditionally defined as a systematic contradiction of every valid metaphysical principle. The point is wider than just the Judeo-Christian concept of God. No argument will get you from this world to a supernatural world. No reason will lead you to a world contradicting this one. No method of inference will enable you to leap from existence to a super existence. And let me see, where are we at here? Okay, so that concludes. Ayn Rand was an atheist. I've read a lot of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand was a brilliant woman, but that was one of her flaws, being an atheist, as far as I'm concerned. A question that I keep asking myself is, does one have to be a Christian or a believer in God, at least, in order to be a conservative? And right now, I don't know. I'm tempted to say no, that as long as you can make the presumption for the status quo, as long as you can make the presumption for the individual, that you can be a conservative. But I'm going to stick with, for the time being, I don't know. So when I come back, I'm going to be reading a little bit from The Reactionary Mind. Thank you very much. Welcome back. And the reactionary mind. And we were dealing with, he's getting into how power plays into the dynamic between reactionaries / conservatives and revolutionaries or liberals. Now he's going to get into using slavery as an example of some of this dynamic. One of the reasons that subordinates' exercise of agency so agitates the conservative imagination is that it takes place in an intimate setting. Every great political blast, the storming of the Bastille, the taking of the Winter Palace, the March on Washington, is set off by a private fuse. The contest for rights and standing in the family, the factory, and the field. Politicians and parties talk of constitution and amendment, natural rights and inherited privileges, but the real subject of their deliberations is the private life of power. Quote, "Here is the secret of the opposition to women's equality in the state," unquote, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote. Quote, "Men are not ready to recognize it in the home," unquote. Behind the right in the street or debate in Parliament is the maid talking back to her mistress, the worker disobeying her boss. This is why our political arguments, not only about the family, but also the welfare state, civil rights, and much else, can be so explosive. They touch upon the most personal relations of power. It is also why it has so often fallen to our novelists to explain to us our politics. At the height of the civil rights movement, James Baldwin traveled to Tallahassee. There, in an imagined handshake, he found the hidden transcript of a constitutional crisis. Quote, "I am the only Negro passenger at Tallahassee's shambles of an airport. It is an oppressively sunny day. A black chauffeur leading a small dog on a leash is meeting his white employer. He is attentive to the dog, covertly very aware of me and respectful of her in a curiously watchful, waiting way. She is middle-aged, beaming and powdery-faced, delighted to see both the beings who made her life agreeable. I am sure that it has never occurred to her that either of them has the ability to judge her or would judge her harshly. She might almost, as she goes toward her chauffeur, be greeting a friend. No friend could make her face brighter. If she were smiling at me that way, I would expect to shake her hand. But if I should put out my hand, panic, bafflement, and horror would then overtake that face. The atmosphere would darken, and danger, even the threat of death, would immediately fill the air. On such small signs and symbols does the Southern Kabbalah depend." Unquote. The conflict over American slavery, the looming precedent to this set piece of Baldwin's imagination, offers an instructive example. One of the distinguishing characteristics of slavery in the United States is that unlike slaves in the Caribbean or serfs in Russia, many slaves in the South lived on small holdings with their masters in residence. Masters knew their slaves' names, tracked their births, marriages, and deaths, and held parties to honor these dates. The personal interaction between master and slave was unparalleled, leading a visiting Frederick Law Olmsted to remark upon the, quote, "close cohabitation and association of black and white," unquote, in Virginia. The, quote, "familiarity and closeness of intimacy that would have been noticed with astonishment, if not with manifest displeasure, in almost any chance company at the North," unquote. Only the, quote, "relations of husband and wife, parent and child, brother and sister," unquote, wrote the slavery apologist Thomas Dew, produced, quote, "a closer tie," unquote, than that of master and slave. The latter relationship, declared William Harper, another defender of slavery, was, quote, "one of the most intimate relations of society," unquote. Conversely, after slavery was abolished, many whites lamented the chill in relations between the races. Quote, "I'm fond of the Negro," unquote, said one Mississippian in 1918. Quote, "but the bond between us is not as close as it was between my father and his slaves," unquote. Much of this talk was propaganda and self-delusion, of course, but in one respect it was not. The nearness of master to slave did make for an exceptionally personal mode of rule. Masters devised and enforced, quote, "unusually detailed," quote, unquote, rules for their slaves, dictating when they had to get up, eat, work, sleep, garden, visit, and pray. Masters decided upon their slaves' mates and marriages. They named their children, and when the market dictated, separated those children from their parents. And while masters, as well as their sons and overseers, availed themselves of the bodies of their female slaves whenever they wished, they saw fit to patrol and punish any and all sexual congress between their slaves. Living with their slaves, masters had direct means to control their behavior and a detailed map of all their behavior there was to control. The consequences of this proximity were felt not just by the slave, but by the master as well. Living every day with his mastery, he became entirely identified with it. So complete was this identification that any sign of the slave's disobedience, much less her emancipation, was seen as an intolerable assault upon his person. When Calhoun declared that slavery, quote, has grown up with our society and institutions and is so interwoven with them that to destroy it would be to destroy us as a people, unquote, he wasn't just referring to society in the aggregate or abstract. He was thinking of individual men absorbed in the day-to-day experiences of ruling other men and women. Take that experience away, and you destroyed not only the master, but also the man, and the many men who sought to become or thought they already were like the master. Because the master put so little distance between himself and his mastery, he would go to unprecedented lengths to keep his holdings. Throughout the Americas, slaveholders defended their privileges, but nowhere with such intensity or violence of the master class in the South. Outside the South, wrote C. Van Woodward, the end of slavery was, quote, the liquidation of an investment, unquote. Inside, it was, quote, the death of a society, unquote. And when, after the Civil War, the master class fought with equal ferocity to restore its privileges and power, it was the proximity of command, the nearness of rule that was uppermost in his mind. As Henry McNeil Turner, a black Republican in Georgia, put it in 1871, quote, they do not care so much about Congress admitting Negroes to their halls, but they do not want the Negroes over them at home, unquote. 100 years later, a black sharecropper in Mississippi would still resort to the most domestic of idioms to describe relations between blacks and whites. Quote, we had to mind them as our children mind us, unquote. When the conservative looks upon a democratic movement from below, this and the exercise of agency is what he sees. A terrible disturbance in the private life of power. Witnessing the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800, Theodore Sedgwick lamented, quote, the aristocracy of virtue is destroyed. Personal influence is at an end, unquote. Sometimes the conservative is personally implicated in that life, sometimes not. Regardless, it is his apprehension of the private grievance behind the public commotion that lends his theory its tactical ingenuity and moral ferocity. Quote, the real object, unquote, of the French Revolution, Burke told Parliament in 1790, is, quote, to break all those connections, natural and civil, that regulate and hold together the community by a chain of subordination, to raise soldiers against their officers, servants against their masters, tradesmen against their customers, artificers against their employers, tenants against their landlords, curates against their bishops, and children against their parents, unquote. Personal insubordination rapidly became a regular and constant theme of Burke's pronouncements on the unfolding events in France. A year later, he wrote in a letter that because of the revolution, quote, no house is safe from its servants, and no officer from its soldiers, and no state or constitution from conspiracy and insurrection, unquote. In another speech before Parliament in 1791, he declared that, quote, a constitution founded on what was called the rights of man opened, quote, Pandora's box, unquote, throughout the world, including Haiti. Quote, blacks rose against whites, whites against black, and each against one another in its murderous hostility. Subordination was destroyed, unquote. Nothing to the Jacobins, he declared at the end of his life, was worthy, quote, of the name of the public virtue, unless it indicates violence on the private, unquote. So powerful is that vision of private eruption that it can turn a man of reform into a man of reaction. Schooled in the Enlightenment, John Adams believed that, quote, consent of the people, unquote, was, quote, the only moral foundation of government, unquote. But when his wife suggested that a muted version of these principles be extended to the family, he was not pleased. Quote, and by the way, unquote, Abigail wrote him, quote, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could, unquote. Her husband's response, quote, we have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices were disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first imitation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented, unquote. Though he leavened his response with playful banter, he prayed that George Washington would shield him from the, quote, despotism of the petticoat, unquote. Adams was clearly rattled by this appearance of democracy in the private sphere. In a letter to James Sullivan, he worried that the revolution would, quote, confound and destroy all distinctions, unquote, unleashing throughout society a spirit of insubordination so intense that all order would be dissolved. Quote, there would be no end of it, unquote. No matter how democratic the state, it was imperative that society remain a federation of private dominions where husbands ruled over wives, masters governed apprentices, and each, quote, should know his place and be made to keep it, unquote. So I'm going to stop right there for the time being, and I think it's fascinating stuff about the idea of conservatives being concerned. The whole dynamic is being one of power, the dynamic between left and right, and that conservatives being concerned about extending power to subordinates in all areas of life. It's also interesting to me because I've never looked at my personal life or society in the way that this is describing. I don't know of any such, the idea that of being a master. I have no idea of that. I've never been a slave. I've never been a master. So it just, to me, I assumed that it was like, as he described, that it was basically, the end of slavery was the end of, it was a more of an economic injury than anything else. And apparently in other places it was. But in any case, I don't know of that. I also have never heard of, and didn't grow up with, this idea that the man of the house was the king of the castle. That's basically what he's describing here. And saying that along with political changes, then come changes to the household, in which the man is no longer king of the castle, and so therefore conservatives are afraid of that and are fighting that kind of change. So, anyways, who are the true conservatives? They are the people that understand that conservatism is a lifestyle. They are patriotic people who use common sense. They make judgments instead of predictions, speak clearly and definitively, and are not afraid to say no. They are open-minded, asking why rather than why not. They're consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of their existence, unafraid to learn or correct their mistakes. They are normal Americans. And that brings me to the conclusion of another episode of The Drill. And until next time, thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.